I thought it was just another routine visit to the clinic, but I was wrong. James had never enjoyed going to the hospital. The cold, sterile atmosphere always made him feel uncomfortable. The white walls, the harsh fluorescent lights, and the faint smell of antiseptic in the air were enough to remind him why he put off medical appointments as long as possible. He didn't expect today to be any different. Just a quick exam and a few routine questions, and he'd be out the door before he knew it. But as he sat on the examination table, tapping his fingers against the cold metal, he couldn't shake a strange feeling. Something felt different today, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The door opened and a nurse walked in. Her name tag read Sophie. She was young, maybe in her mid-20s, with a bright, easy smile that made James feel a little more at ease. Sophie had sharp eyes, the kind that seemed to take in everything at once. Her movements were fluid, almost graceful, as she approached him, clipboard in hand. She asked the usual questions. Her voice was soft but professional as she checked his vitals and made notes. Nothing unusual at first. James paid little attention to her manner. She was just doing her job, but there was something about the way she moved around the room, the way her gaze lingered on him just a moment too long, that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He chalked it up to nerves. After all, he hated clinics. But the feeling stayed. "Mr. Davis," Sophie said with a polite smile. "Smile. The doctor will be with you shortly. Wait here." James nodded and offered a weak smile in return as she left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the strange tension that seemed to hang in the air. Maybe he was just thinking too much. It was a routine visit, nothing more. But as the minutes ticked by, the uneasy feeling only grew stronger when Sophie returned. Something had changed. James couldn't put his finger on what it was, but the air between them felt different. Her expression was still friendly, but there was a new focus in her eyes, a quiet intensity that hadn't been there before. She approached him again, this time without the clipboard, and stood by the examination table, closer than before. "We just need to check a few more things," she said. "Then you're all set?" James nodded again, though he couldn't shake the strange feeling that was building in his chest. He watched as she moved to take his pulse, her fingers brushing against his wrist. The touch was innocent enough, but it lingered. He could feel his skin tingling under her fingers, and he could feel his heart rate increasing. It wasn't because of the examination. It was because of the way her touch seemed to linger just a moment too long. He looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. He held her gaze for a split second and saw something that made him gasp. It wasn't just a routine examination. The way she looked at him, the way her fingers brushed over his skin felt different. He tried to ignore it, telling himself he was imagining things. But as Sophie continued with the examination, the tension in the room grew. Her movements were still professional, but there was an unspoken charge in the air between them that James couldn't ignore. "Go ahead and unbutton your pants," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of something else. He hesitated for a second, caught off guard by the request. It wasn't unusual in a medical setting, but the way she said it felt personal. Swallowing hard, he nodded slowly as he complied, noticing the way Sophie's eyes were fixed on him. She kept her eyes on him, looking between his face and his hands. His heart began to race, not because of the test itself, but because of the way she was watching him. The air between them felt thick, almost suffocating, and James couldn't tell if it was just his imagination or something more. He shifted on the examination table, trying to calm his breathing, but when he looked up again, Sophie's eyes were locked on his. This time there was no mistaking the change in her expression. There was something intriguing and curious about her gaze. As she moved closer to continue the examination, James felt a shiver run down his spine. "Just checking here," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Now her fingers brushed against his skin again, this time with more purpose. The touch sent a rush of heat through him. He tried to remain still and calm, but it was impossible. The way she looked at him, the way her fingers lingered on his skin, made his pulse race. He hadn't expected that. Neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was heavy, charged with something unspoken, something neither of them dared acknowledge, but it was there, hanging in the air between them. Undeniable. "You're tense," Sophie said softly, her hand resting lightly on his thigh, her touch gentle, but with a firmness and confidence that made James's heart pound even harder. He nodded, even though relaxing was the last thing he could do at the moment. Her touch lingered longer than it should have, her fingers brushing against him again in a way that made James's breath catch in his throat. His body reacted instinctively, and he could tell that Sophie noticed. Her eyes dropped to where his pants were still partially undone, and James felt a surge of heat go through him as her lips parted slightly. He thought she was going to say something, but she didn't. Instead, she hesitated. For a moment, her hands were still on his leg, her fingers tracing patterns on his skin. "I'm just going to check," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It seemed as if she wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. Her hand moved slowly and carefully, but the touch wasn't clinical anymore. James could feel the warmth of her palm against his skin, the way her fingers brushed lightly over the fabric of his underwear. He couldn't stop the soft breath that escaped him. The situation was overwhelming. The room suddenly felt too small and too intimate, as if the walls were closing in around them. His breathing became shallow. James' breathing became shallow, and he could feel the tension between them growing with each passing second. He couldn't concentrate on anything else. His mind was racing as Sophie's fingers continued to brush his skin with a touch that no longer felt professional. Every movement she made and every breath she took seemed to fill the small room with a growing tension. The sterile white walls and the scent of antiseptic faded into the background as the unspoken connection between them took over. He shifted slightly on the examination table, trying to steady his breathing, but it was impossible to ignore the heat that was building between them. He felt a sudden, intense awareness, as if they were caught in a moment neither of them had planned. Sophie's touch became more deliberate, her fingers lingering on his skin for a second longer than necessary. James swallowed hard, his pulse racing as her hand brushed against him again. He wasn't sure if it was his imagination, but it felt as if she was taking her time, as if every move had a purpose beyond the usual medical one. She was just doing her job, but her fingers trailed lightly along the waistband of his underwear, adjusting the fabric ever so slightly. James felt a shiver run down his spine, his heart pounding in his chest and every nerve in his body on high alert. He looked up at her, met her eyes for the briefest of moments, and saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Sophie's look had changed. It was no longer distant and professional. It was personal, intimate, and intense. He could see it in her eyes, the way they darkened slightly and the way her lips parted as if she was about to say something. "I'll just check here," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hand moved again, sliding lower with a touch that sent a wave of heat through him. James tried to stay still, but his body had a mind of its own. Every time her fingers brushed against his skin, it was like a little jolt of electricity went through him. The air between them felt thick and heavy with something unspoken, and neither of them seemed to know how to break the tension. James could feel the heat rising in his chest, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps as Sophie's hand continued its slow, deliberate movements. It was all too much. The closeness, the warmth of her body next to his, the way her touch made his pulse race. He looked up at her again, his eyes locked with hers, and for a long moment neither of them said a word. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything that was happening, everything. What was about to happen? Sophie's lips parted slightly, her breath catching as she hesitated. Her hands were still on his thigh. "You're tense," she said softly, her voice almost too low to be heard. She pressed her fingers gently against his skin, bringing him back to consciousness. James nodded, though relaxing was the last thing on his mind. The tension between them was palpable and growing by the second. He didn't know how to stop it. He wasn't even sure he wanted to. "It's okay," Sophie whispered. Her hand moved again, brushing against him in a way that made his heart skip a beat. "Just relax," she said. Her words were soothing, but they didn't calm the storm inside him. James felt his body react to her touch. His skin tingled under her fingers, and he knew she could feel it, too. He couldn't hide the way his breath quickened or the way his muscles tensed. Sophie's eyes dropped to where his pants were still partially undone, and James felt a rush of heat flood his body. Her lips parted again, and she hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering on him with a look that was both curious and intrigued. James thought she might pull away for a second, that the moment would pass and things would return to normal. But then she leaned in a little closer, her breath warm against his skin. The room around them seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the tension grew. "I'm just going to check," Sophie murmured again, her voice barely audible. But there was something different about the way she said it this time. It was softer, more familiar. Her hand moved again, this time more purposefully. It was as if the line between professional and personal had been completely erased. James' breath caught in his throat. When Sophie's fingers brushed against him again, the touch was no longer clinical. There was a warmth to it now, a tenderness that sent a shiver of anticipation through him. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his whole body reacting to her in ways he hadn't expected. The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the faint rustle of fabric as Sophie adjusted his clothing just enough to continue her examination, but her touch lingered longer than necessary. Her fingers traced light, delicate patterns across his skin, making it impossible for James to stay still. He could feel the heat emanating from her. Her body was warm against his as she moved closer. Every move she made felt deliberate and calculated, as if testing the waters to see how far she could go without crossing a line from which neither of them could return. James' heart raced when Sophie's hand brushed against him again. This time he looked up at her with more confidence. His eyes met hers, and he saw something that made him gasp. He knew this wasn't just a routine examination. The air between them was charged with something unspoken and undeniable. Neither of them moved for a moment, and the silence stretched out. James' pulse quickened as he tried to stay still, but it became harder with each passing second. Sophie's hand moved again, brushing against him in a way that made his whole body tense with anticipation. He could feel desire building inside of him, a heat he hadn't expected but couldn't deny. Looking up at her again, he saw the same desire reflected in her eyes. This wasn't just a routine examination, this was something else entirely. Then she sat James still, his heart beating fast in his chest, his mind racing. He'd been in clinics countless times, undergone routine checkups and simple examinations, nothing ever out of the ordinary. But this was different. He could feel the change. In the air, something intangible but undeniable. Sophie's request echoed in his mind, and he wondered if he had heard her right. He hesitated, his fingers hovering near his waistband, unsure of how to react. Was this normal? Was this part of the routine? He had never felt so out of place in a doctor's office. Usually it was cold, sterile, and distant, which he liked. But now the room felt personal and charged. James swallowed hard. His throat was suddenly dry. He looked up at Sophie, who was standing a little too close. Her eyes were locked on his with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. Her expression was calm, professional, and even, but there was something in her gaze that made his pulse quicken. There was more, he thought. Is this part of the test? James asked. His voice came out harsher than he intended. He cleared his throat, trying to compose himself, but it was impossible to ignore the tension that James felt with a growing sense of unease as he watched Sophie's eyes trace the outline of his hands as they hovered near his waistband. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if debating something inside. Then, with a small smile, she nodded her head in agreement. Her voice was soft and reassuring, but there was a subtle shift in her tone that made James' skin tingle with awareness. "I just need to check a few things," she said, unsure if James believed her. He nodded and his hands moved to unbutton his pants anyway, his fingers trembling slightly as he unbuttoned his pants, cursing himself for his nerves. This was just a test, nothing more. He was overthinking it, reading too much into things. But as he pulled down the zipper and felt Sophie's gaze on him, it became harder to convince himself that this was just another routine checkup. The air in the room seemed thicker, almost suffocating, and every movement felt charged with an energy he didn't understand. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating, and every movement was charged with an energy he didn't understand. His heart pounded in his chest as he lowered the waistband of his pants just enough for Sophie to continue the examination. He tried to stay calm and focus on something other than the way her eyes followed his every move. He couldn't help but move, but it was impossible. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point, and James could feel it in every inch of his body. Sophie moved closer, her fingers brushing lightly against his skin as she adjusted his clothes. The touch was soft, almost feathery, but it sent a shock of awareness through him that made his breath catch. She was still professional, at least on the outside, but there was something different about the way she touched him now. It wasn't clinical at all. Her fingers lingered just a moment longer than necessary, and James felt a wave of heat rush through him. James' heart was racing as he tried to stay still. He wasn't sure if it was just his imagination, but it felt like Sophie was taking her time, her movements slow and deliberate, as if testing the boundaries of what was appropriate and what wasn't. The silence in the room was deafening. Neither spoke, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. The tension between them was palpable. James looked up at Sophie, and their eyes met for a brief moment. He saw the same awareness and heat reflected in her gaze. For a second, he thought she would stop, pull away, and the moment would pass. Instead, she leaned in just a little. She moved closer, her breath warm against his skin as she continued the examination at a slow, deliberate pace. Her fingers brushed against him again, this time with more purpose. James felt his body react instinctively, his muscles tensing under her touch. "Just checking here," Sophie murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. There was something different about the way she spoke, something softer and more intimate. It was as if the line between professional and something else had completely disappeared. James' breath caught in his throat as her hand moved again, her fingers tracing a slow, deliberate path across his skin. The touch was light, but it sent a rush of heat through him, making it hard to stay still. He could feel his body reacting to her in ways he hadn't expected. His heart was racing, his pulse pounding in his ears, and the air between them was thick and charged with an unspoken attention that neither of them seemed to acknowledge. James' mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but it was impossible. All he could focus on was the way her fingers moved against his skin, the warmth of her breath and the closeness of her body to his. For a moment, neither of them moved and the silence between them was heavy, and James felt like he was suffocating in the small examination room. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he was breathing in short, shallow breaths. He tried to remain calm, but it was impossible to ignore the heat building between them and the way his body responded to her touch. Sophie's fingers brushed against him again, this time with more confidence. James felt a shiver run down his spine. He looked up at her, their eyes meeting, and for a long moment they just stared at each other. The silence between them was filled with the weight of everything that had happened. "You are tense," Sophie said. Her hand now rested lightly on his thigh. Her touch was gentle, but there was a firmness to it that made James' heart pound even harder. He nodded, even though relaxing was the last thing he could do at the moment. The tension between them was unbearable, growing with each passing second. He wasn't sure how much longer he could stand it. "I can't take it much longer," he said. "It's okay, Sophie," she replied, moving her fingers again to brush lightly against his skin. "Just relax." James swallowed hard, his throat dry, his head spinning. He tried to focus on her words, to calm the storm that was brewing inside him, but it was impossible every time she touched him. The slightest touch of her fingers against his skin sent a jolt through him, making it harder to stay still. The silence in the room was overwhelming, the air thick with tension. James' breath came in short, uneven gasps, and his pulse raced as Sophie's hand moved again, her fingers tracing light patterns across his skin. It was all too much. The closeness, the warmth of her body next to his, the way her touch made his pulse race. He didn't know how to stop it, and part of him didn't want to. Her touch was soft and careful, but there was nothing clinical about it. James could feel his pulse racing, his heart pounding in his chest as Sophie's fingers lingered on his skin. The room felt small now, too small. The walls were closing in as the tension between them grew thicker and more palpable. It became impossible to focus on anything but the way her hand moved and the way her fingers brushed against him. It was clear that this was no longer a routine examination. The silence stretched out, heavy and charged with something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. James' breath came in shallow gasps. His body responded to her touch in ways he couldn't control. It was as if his skin had come alive under her fingertips, every nerve on high alert, his senses overwhelmed by the growing intensity between them. The intensity between them was growing. Sophie didn't pull away. In fact, she seemed bolder, her movements more deliberate, her touch lingering just a little too long. She was still professional, at least on the outside, but there was no mistaking the change in the air. This was no longer about medical necessity. There was something more here, something that neither of them could deny anymore. James shifted slightly on the examination table, trying to find a way to steady himself, but it was impossible. Every time her fingers brushed across his skin, he got a shiver, his muscles tensing in anticipation. He wasn't sure if it was his imagination, but it felt like Sophie's hand was moving slower now, her touch more intimate and deliberate. "I'll just check here," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, his throat too dry to answer. He tried to focus on the ceiling, or anything that would distract him from the heat that was building between them. But it was useless. All he could think about was the way her fingers felt against his skin, the way her breath seemed to come a little faster, a little shallower, as the tension in the room grew thicker with each passing second. Sophie's hand moved lower, her fingers brushing lightly against his thigh. James felt a wave of heat rush through him. His breath caught in his throat, his body reacting instinctively to the touch, and he knew she could feel it too. There was no hiding it. The way his muscles tensed under her hand, and he couldn't ignore the way his pulse quickened whenever her fingers moved just a little too close to him. He looked up at her, his eyes locked with hers, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze. The world outside the exam room faded away, leaving only the two of them trapped in a moment neither of them had expected. Sophie's eyes were dark, her gaze intense as she looked down at him. James could see it now. The desire, the curiosity, the unspoken. For a brief second, a question hung in the air between them. He thought she would pull away or step back and the moment would pass, leaving them both to pretend nothing had happened. Instead, she leaned closer, her breath warm against his skin, her hand lingering on his thigh in a way that felt anything but professional. "I'll just check here," she repeated, her voice softer now, more intimate. Her fingers moved again, tracing slow, deliberate patterns across his skin. James felt his body respond, his pulse quickening, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold back, how much longer he could pretend this was just a normal checkup. The tension between them was too thick, too intense, and he could feel himself teetering on the edge of something he wasn't sure he could control. Sophie's hand moved again, this time more assertively. Her fingers brushed against him in a way that made his whole body tense with anticipation. James swallowed hard, his throat feeling dry, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't supposed to be happening. This was just a routine examination, nothing more. But the way her touch lingered, the way her eyes locked with his, made it clear that they had momentarily crossed a line. Neither of them moved. The silence in the room was suffocating, the air thick with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. James could feel the heat building inside him, a slow burn. James felt a burning sensation he couldn't ignore. His body responded to her touch, his muscles tensing and his skin tingling with awareness. He knew she could feel it as well. He looked up at her. Their eyes met, and something changed. The air between them seemed to crackle with electricity, to reach a boiling point. Sophie's hand lingered on his thigh, tracing slow, deliberate circles across his skin. James felt himself slipping. He was losing control. He opened his mouth to speak, to say something, anything that would break the tension. But no words came out. Instead, he watched as Sophie's eyes fell to where his pants were still partially undone. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Then, as if a decision had been made without either of them speaking, Sophie leaned closer. Her breath was warm against his ear. She whispered, "You're responding well?" Her voice was soft, but James' heart was racing as he nodded, his throat too dry to respond. His body responded to her touch in ways he hadn't expected. He knew she could feel it, and the tension between them was now unbearable. The air was thick with anticipation, and James wasn't sure how much longer he could hold himself back. Sophie's hand moved lower, brushing against him with a touch that was both gentle and electrifying. James's breath caught in his throat as a wave of heat rushed through him. He could feel the desire building inside him. It was becoming impossible to ignore. Her fingers traced slow, deliberate patterns across his skin. Her touch was light but focused. James could feel himself unraveling under her hand. His hands felt alive. Every nerve in his body seemed to come alive under her touch. His senses were overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. "I've wanted to do this ever since you walked in," Sophie whispered in his ear, her lips close to his skin. Since the moment he had seen her, her words had sent a thrill through him. He felt a rush of heat that made his heart beat faster. He felt himself slipping away, losing control. He knew there was no turning back. The line had been crossed. They were both lost in the moment, caught up in the overwhelming intensity of their desire. James' breath came in short, shallow gasps as he leaned into her. His lips brushed against hers, soft and hesitant at first, but quickly deepening as the desire between them boiled over. Sophie's hand kept moving, sending waves of heat through him. James felt himself losing control, surrendering to the intensity of the moment. The sterile, clinical atmosphere of the room faded away, replaced by the intoxicating closeness that had enveloped them. The connection between them was undeniable, and their desire grew as James knew there was no turning back. With one look, it was clear that we'd crossed a line from which we could never return. He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. A mixture of excitement and fear coursed through his veins. The intensity between him and Sophie had escalated to a point where it was undeniable and impossible to ignore. The kiss they had just shared was the tipping point. What had started as a subtle shift in the air had now become a full-blown storm, and neither of them could stop it. Sophie's lips were close to his, her breath warm against his skin. She waited for him to make the next move. Her eyes were fixed on his, filled with an emotion he hadn't seen before. Desire, yes, but also something deeper. Something that made his heart race even faster. James could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as he leaned closer and pressed his lips against hers once more. This time the kiss wasn't tentative or soft. It was charged and electric, fueled by tension. There was a connection between them from the moment they entered the room. Sophie responded immediately, her hand tightening on his thigh as she kissed him back with the same intensity. Her fingers traced slow, deliberate patterns on his skin, sending waves of heat through him. James's body responded instinctively, his muscles tensing as desire finally broke free. The sterile clinic room faded away, replaced by the heat of the moment. James was clinical about what was happening now. His mind was racing with thoughts, scattered as he tried to make sense of it all. But the intensity of their connection overwhelmed everything else. James' hands moved to Sophie's waist, pulling her closer. He could feel the warmth of her body pressing against his every touch. Each kiss felt like a promise, an unspoken agreement that they had both crossed a line. The tension between them had turned into something more. It was a raw, primal need that neither of them could resist. Sophie's breath caught as James' hands slid up her body. Her back, her lips parted as she deepened the kiss. He could feel her heart racing beneath his fingertips, mirroring the frantic beat of his own. Their bodies seemed to move in sync, driven by a shared desire that had been quietly building from the moment they met. He wasn't sure how it had come to this, how a simple routine checkup had turned into something so charged, so intense. But now that they were here in this moment, there was no turning back. The line had been crossed, and James knew that whatever came next would change everything. Sophie's hand moved again, this time more deliberately, her fingers brushing against him. James' body reacted instinctively. His muscles tensed, his skin prickled with awareness. He could feel the heat radiating from her, the warmth of her breath on his neck as she kissed him again, this time with a hunger that sent a jolt of electricity through him. There was a sudden rush of electricity through him, and their movements grew more urgent and frantic as the intensity of the moment took over. James could feel the slow burn of desire building inside him, a heat that was becoming impossible to ignore. His breath came in ragged gasps as Sophie's hand slid lower, her touch both gentle and deliberate. "You're pushing me to the edge of control," James whispered, his voice strained and barely able to form the words. Sophie smiled against his lips, her breath hot against his skin as she murmured, "Good." Her fingers continued their slow, agonizingly perfect rhythm, and James could feel himself unraveling under her touch. Every nerve in his body was on fire, every inch of his skin alive with sensation. The heat between them was becoming unbearable. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold out or resist the pull of the moment. Sophie's lips moved from his mouth to his neck, leaving a trail of soft, heated kisses that made James' skin tingle. His hands tightened around her waist, pulling her closer. He couldn't resist the pull between them. Every touch, every kiss felt like it was fanning the flames of desire, pushing them both closer to the point of no return. He shouldn't do this, Sophie whispered against his skin, but there was no hesitation in her voice. Her words made the moment feel more intense and forbidden, as if they were crossing a line from which neither of them could ever return. James couldn't hold back anymore. The heat between them was intense. The connection that had begun as a subtle spark had grown into a roaring fire. He kissed her again, his hands moving to her hips, pulling her closer as their bodies pressed together. The sterile, clinical atmosphere of the room was gone. It had been replaced by the intoxicating closeness that had enveloped them. The tension between them had shifted, becoming something more primal, more intense. James knew there was no going back now. Sophie's hand moved lower, brushing against him with a touch that made his whole body tense with need. James could feel the tension building. It was getting tighter and tighter inside him. He could feel a slow burn that was becoming impossible to ignore. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as the intensity between them reached its breaking point. He knew they had crossed a line, but he didn't care. In this moment, nothing mattered but the overwhelming desire that had overtaken them both. The connection between them was undeniable. James could feel himself slipping, losing control as the heat between them grew more intense. Sophie's lips found his again. She kissed him deeply and hungrily. James knew there was no turning back now. They were lost in the moment. They were caught up in the moment and didn't think about the consequences. All that mattered was the intensity of their desire and the overwhelming need that had consumed them both. The world outside the clinic faded away, leaving only the two of them. They were lost in the heat of the moment, caught in the storm of their own making. James knew without a doubt that this was a line they could never cross. There was no going back. They were lost in the moment. James couldn't think clearly. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, sensations, and raw desire that refused to be ignored. Every fiber of his James was focused on the woman standing before him. He could feel her lips against his, and the heat of her body pressed against his. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, and impossible to resist. Sophie's hands moved confidently now, no longer tentative or hesitant. There was a certainty in her touch and a knowing that made James' breath come faster, his pulse race and his body respond to her every move. Every stroke of her fingers sent electric sparks through his skin. The tension that had been building between them had reached its peak, and James knew with absolute certainty that he was teetering on the edge of control. Sophie's fingers moved lower, her touch light but deliberate, and James felt a deep shiver run through him. He hadn't expected any of this, not when he'd walked into the clinic earlier that day, certainly not when he'd sat on the cold, sterile examination table. But now, as Sophie's hand moved against his skin, all those earlier moments felt distant and unimportant. All that mattered now was the fire that had ignited between them. Her lips found his again, soft at first, but quickly deepening with an intensity that matched the fevered heat of their connection. James' hands slid around her waist, pulling her closer. He pulled her closer, feeling the rapid beating of her heart against his chest, matching his own. It was as if they were both surrendering to the moment, to the pull of something far greater than either of them could control. His fingers tightened around her waist, pulling her closer as Sophie pressed against him with equal force. The feel of her body against his sent his senses into overdrive, every movement and touch adding to the fire that burned between them. James' mind was clouded, consumed by the need that pulsed through his veins. There was no room for rational thought or hesitation. All that mattered was Sophie, the way she kissed him, the way her body fit against his. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. Sophie's breath caught as James' hands moved lower. His fingers pressed against the small of her back, pulling her even closer. Her lips parted as she let out a soft gasp. Her body trembled at his touch. James knew she felt it too. The same searing intensity. The same undeniable connection. The sterile clinic room faded into the background as they lost themselves in each other. The antiseptic scent. The harsh fluorescent lights. The cold of the examination table didn't matter anymore. All James could focus on was Sophie. Her lips. Her hands. The feel of her body against his. "I wanted this." Sophie's voice was a whisper, barely audible but filled with a raw need that made James' heart skip a beat. As she spoke, James felt a shiver run through his body. His heartbeat quickened as her confession sank in. He hadn't expected it, hadn't seen it coming, but now that they were here, caught in the heat of the moment, he realized that maybe he'd wanted it too, from the moment she'd walked into the room. From the moment her eyes had lingered a little too long on his, there had been something between them. Neither of them could ignore it. James leaned down and kissed her. His lips were soft and persistent. His body felt alive with her touch. Every nerve tingled with anticipation. Sophie's hands moved with more urgency. Her fingers brushed against his skin in a way that made his breath catch. The tension between them was unbearable. It grew stronger with each passing second. James knew they had both crossed a point of no return. Sophie's touch was deliberate and sure. Even though she knew exactly what she was doing, James felt himself losing control, slipping deeper into the moment. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, his muscles tensing as her fingers continued their slow, purposeful movements. It was impossible to think clearly. The room around them seemed to shrink, the air thick with the heat of their shared desire. Every inch of James' skin felt alive under her touch, every nerve on high alert as the intensity between them reached a fever pitch. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold out, how much longer he could resist. The moment was becoming too much for James. He whispered, his voice harsh with need. Sophie's lips curved into a small smile. Her breath warmed his skin as she whispered back, "I'm not trying to resist anymore." Her words hung in the air between them, sealing the moment. James knew that. There was no going back now. They were both in too deep. They were both caught in the fire that had ignited between them, and neither of them wanted to stop. So Sophie's fingers moved with more urgency and confidence. James could feel the slow burn of desire building inside him. It was becoming impossible to ignore. He couldn't ignore the way his body was reacting to her touch. His breath came in ragged gasps as the tension tightened inside him. He looked up at her and met her gaze. What he saw in her eyes made his heart race even faster. There was no doubt, no hesitation, just the same raw intensity. He could feel it pulsing through his own veins, the same undeniable need that had overtaken them both. James' hands moved to her waist, pulling her even closer. His body pressed against hers as their movements became more urgent and frantic. The sterile clinic setting was completely forgotten, replaced by the all-consuming heat of their connection. The bond between them was intense. Sophie's breath caught as James' hands slid lower, her body trembling against his as the moment built to a crescendo. Every touch and kiss sent a wave of heat through him, and James knew they were both teetering on the edge of something. "They can't control you like this," Sophie said, her voice barely more than a breath, but filled with a confidence that made James' heart pound in his chest. James nodded, unable to form words, his breath coming in shallow gasps as Sophie's touch pushed him closer and closer to the edge. The slow, steady burn that was building inside him was reaching its peak, and he could feel himself losing control as the heat between them grew more intense. Her fingers moved lower, pressing against him with more purpose, and James felt a jolt of electricity run through him. His body responded instantly, his muscles tightening as the heat built to an almost unbearable level. Sophie's lips brushed against his ear, her breath hot and teasing as she whispered, "Let go." James felt the tension inside him break, waves of pleasure washing over him as he surrendered completely to the moment. His whole body shook, every muscle tightening as the sensation overwhelmed him. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. His mind was clouded by the intensity of it all. For a brief moment, it felt as if the world had stopped, leaving only the two of them in the midst of an overwhelming moment. Sophie held him close, her fingers still moving gently, guiding him through the release. Her lips planted soft kisses on his neck, his cheek and his lips. James could feel her breath warm and steady as she whispered soft words. She soothed him with her body, still pressed tightly against his. James knew that something had changed between them, something that couldn't be undone. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I've wanted this since the moment I saw you." The moment hung between them, heavy and charged, as James' breath slowly returned. He could still feel the heat of Sophie's touch and the weight of her words in his mind. Her confession made him shiver, not only because of its intensity, but because it made everything that had just happened seem more significant and real. Sophie's eyes were still locked on his, and James could see the vulnerability there now. There was a slight tremor in her lips, as if she was unsure how he would react. Her confidence, which had been so strong just moments ago, seemed to waver slightly in the wake of her confession. It was as if the weight of what they had just shared had finally settled between them, neither of them quite sure what to do next. James swallowed hard, trying to gather his thoughts. He hadn't expected this when he had entered the clinic that morning. He'd thought it would be just another day, just another routine checkup. But now, as he stood there, still close to Sophie, James realized that everything had changed. This was what he'd wanted from the moment he'd walked in. "Do you want this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked into her eyes, looking for confirmation. He didn't want to misinterpret the situation. Sophie nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "I know she admitted quietly. "It was unprofessional, and I shouldn't have done it, but I couldn't help it. From the moment I saw you, I just felt something." Her words hung in the air between them, vulnerable and exposed, and James could feel the weight of them pressing down on his chest. He hadn't expected this level of honesty, or this kind of raw emotion. It was as if Sophie had laid it all out for him, and now it was his turn to respond. James took a deep breath. His heart was still racing from the intensity of their moment together. He wasn't sure what to say or how to put into words the strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. Desire, confusion, excitement, and a sense of connection he hadn't felt in a long time. Sophie and James began. James' voice was rough and tense. He wasn't used to feeling so vulnerable, and it made the words catch in his throat. "I didn't expect this," he said. I didn't come here thinking this would happen." Sophie's lips parted slightly, as if she was about to say something, but then she hesitated. The confidence she'd shown earlier had faded, replaced by a kind of nervousness that made James' heart ache for her. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the way she worried about how he would react, how he would interpret her confession. But James continued, moving closer to her, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not saying I didn't want to. I just didn't know I wanted it until it happened." Sophie's eyes softened and a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It wasn't the bold, confident smile she'd worn before. It was something softer, more real. James could feel the tension between them easing into something more tender and intimate. As they relaxed into something more tender and intimate, she asked, "Do you regret it?" James shook his head and said, "No, I don't regret it." Sophie let out a soft breath, as if she had been holding it in. James could see the relief in her eyes and felt a warmth spreading through his chest, knowing that his words had brought her some comfort. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, and the silence between them was filled with a quiet understanding. James could still feel the aftershocks of their moment together. The intensity of their connection remained in the air, but now there was something else, something softer, a mutual acknowledgement of what they had just experienced and what it meant to both of them. "I shouldn't have," she whispered, her eyes flicking down for a moment before meeting his again. "It was wrong," he said. James knew it was wrong, but he didn't regret it. He reached out and placed a hand on her arm, offering a reassuring touch. "We can't change what happened," he said quietly, "but we can decide where we want to go from here." Sophie nodded slowly, her eyes steady. "I just want you to know that I don't think it was just a mistake." James' heart clenched. At her words, he could hear the vulnerability in her voice, cutting through the air between them. He could tell how much this moment meant to her, how much she had put herself out there. In a strange way, it meant something to him as well. He hadn't expected it, but it wasn't a mistake. "I don't think," he said, his voice firm. Sophie smiled, and this time it was a real smile. Her eyes brightened as the tension in her shoulders eased, and the weight of what had just happened between them began to lift. It was replaced by a feeling of mutual understanding that neither of them had planned for, but now that it had happened, they both had to face it. The reality of the situation began to dawn on Sophie. "I've never done anything like this before," she admitted, her voice soft and almost hesitant. James nodded, sensing her concern. "Neither have I," he replied. Sophie stepped closer to him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm lightly. "It felt right," she said, gently. Her eyes searched his for some kind of reassurance. James didn't hesitate. This time he placed his hand over hers, squeezing it gently. "I do," he said, his voice low but sure. They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them comfortable and filled with the weight of everything they'd shared. What they had shared and the unspoken promise of what might come next. The world outside the small clinic room seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them, connected by something they couldn't quite name, but couldn't deny. Sophie let out a soft sigh, her fingers still resting lightly on his arm. "What do we do?" James didn't have an answer. He didn't know what came next, or how they would navigate the complexities of their relationship now that the boundaries between patient and nurse had been so thoroughly crossed. What he did know was that they couldn't ignore the connection they had. "We found each other, and we'll figure it out," James finally said. His voice was calm. Together, Sophie smiled, her eyes softening as she nodded. She found herself in the small clinic room with James. She knew they had crossed a line from which they could never go back. But she also knew that despite everything, she didn't regret it for a second. The heavy silence between them was no longer filled with tension, but with a quiet intimacy that neither of them had expected. Sophie stood a few steps away from him, her fingers fidgeting nervously with the hem of her scrub top. The confidence she had shown earlier had melted into something more tentative. She looked at him with a mix of emotions in her eyes. Uncertainty, curiosity, and maybe even a touch of fear. Fear of what this meant and fear of what was to come. James could still feel the lingering warmth of her touch on his skin, the way her hands had moved against him, and the way her breath had felt on his neck. It was still so fresh and vivid in his mind, but the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. They had crossed a line that could not be erased or ignored, and now they would have to face the consequences. But for now, in the silence of the moment, they remained close. Neither said anything. There were unspoken words between them, things they weren't ready to talk about, but they both understood. James looked at Sophie and wondered for a moment if she regretted what had happened. She had confessed her desire for him and acted on it, which had taken him by surprise. He hadn't expected that. None of this had been on his radar when he entered the clinic that day, but now that it had happened, he couldn't deny the intensity of the connection they had shared. "Are you okay?" James finally asked, his voice soft, breaking the silence between them. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes wide and uncertain, but she nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm fine," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just didn't think it would be like this." James nodded in understanding. He hadn't thought it would happen like this either, but here they were, standing in the aftermath of a moment that had changed everything between them. "Neither did I," James replied. "It was soft, but I don't regret it." Sophie let out a soft breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She stepped closer to him, her hand brushing his arm as she stood before him. Her eyes searched his face for reassurance. She was still. "I think you may be processing everything just as I am," Sophie admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I regret it," she continued, her voice firm. "I don't regret it, James replied, shaking his head. I don't regret it, Sophie said, giving him a small, tentative smile. It didn't quite reach her eyes, but it still managed to ease the tension in the room. James could tell that she was still unsure and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. He couldn't blame her. This wasn't something either of them had planned or expected. I just don't know what comes next, Sophie said quietly, her eyes glancing down to the floor before meeting his again. This is complicated. James nodded and understood what she meant. What had started as a routine checkup had turned into something much more complicated. Neither of them could take it back. The lines between them had blurred, and now they had to figure out where they stood. I agree, James said, but we'll figure it out. We don't need to have all the answers right now. Sophie seemed to relax at his words. The tension in her shoulders eased a little. She moved even closer to him, her fingers resting gently on his arm. The touch was light, but it carried the weight of everything they had just shared. James looked up at her. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the questions she wasn't ready to ask yet. But he also saw something else, something that reflected his feelings. There was no denying that what they had just experienced was powerful, and neither of them could ignore the connection they felt at that moment. We've crossed a line, Sophie said softly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't want to, but we did. James nodded, not shying away from the truth. We did. James replied, I don't think things can go back to the way they were. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of uncertainty in it. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. You don't think so? James shook his head. We can't pretend it didn't happen, he said quietly. What happened between us was real. It happened, but that doesn't mean we have to regret it. We'll figure out what comes next. Sophie bit her lip and looked at the floor as she took in his words. James could see the struggle in her eyes. She was trying to reconcile what had happened with the reality of their situation, and it wasn't easy. He knew it would take time for both of them to come to terms with it. I don't regret it either, Sophie finally said, her voice soft but sure. I just didn't expect it to feel this way. James smiled softly and reached out to place his hand over hers. Neither did I, he admitted, but here we are. Her eyes softened as a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips for a moment. The uncertainty seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet understanding that had grown between them. They didn't have all the answers yet, but they didn't need them. What mattered was that they were both on the same page and willing. They stood in silence for a long moment, the air between them warm and comfortable. The intensity of the moment had passed, leaving behind something quieter, something that felt more like the beginning of whatever came next. What do we do now? Sophie asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. James let out a soft breath and squeezed her hand gently. I don't know, he said honestly, but we'll find out. Sophie smiled. This time it was a real smile, one that reached her eyes. In that moment, James knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. I shouldn't have, she started, but I shook my head and silenced her with a gentle touch. I have no regrets. James watched Sophie's expression soften. Her inner conflict was still playing across her face, though muted. Now, with his reassurances, there was a quiet vulnerability in her eyes that made his chest tighten. It was a look that told him she was still trying to figure out what had happened between them. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, but before she could, he placed his hand on her arm. His touch was light but firm. I'm not sorry, James said quietly. His voice was calm, and his gaze was unwavering as he looked at her. The intensity of his words seemed to reach her, and she exhaled slowly, as if she'd been holding her breath, waiting for some kind of judgment. Sophie bit her lip and her fingers twisted together nervously as she processed his words. We crossed a line, she murmured. I shouldn't have. James nodded, understanding the seriousness of her words. He knew the professional boundaries they had crossed and the potential problems of what had just happened, but he couldn't see their connection as a mistake. James said gently, You're right. We did cross a line, but sometimes things happen that we don't expect. That doesn't make them wrong. His hand slid down her arm, a comforting gesture that felt as natural as everything else that had happened between them. I don't regret it, Sophie. I don't want you to either. Sophie's eyes flickered up to meet his. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, she just looked at him, her gaze searching his face for the sincerity and certainty she needed to find. She seemed to relax a little, the tension in her shoulders easing. I don't want to regret it, she admitted quietly, her voice shaking a little. It's hard not to think about everything and how complicated this is. James could see the weight of her thoughts, the way her mind was probably racing through all the possible outcomes, and the uncertainty of what would come next were things he'd been thinking about as well. But he didn't want her to get lost in that fear. He wanted her to focus on what they'd shared and the undeniable connection between them. Complicated doesn't always mean bad, he replied quietly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It just means we have to figure it out. Sophie let out a soft, almost trembling laugh. Her eyes fell to the floor as she nodded slowly. I don't know how we're going to do this, she murmured, but I don't want this to just go away like it didn't mean anything. James said, it does mean something. His voice was firm, directed at both of us. Her eyes met his, and he could see the uncertainty and fear in them. She was afraid of what their connection might cost them, but beneath that fear was something else. It reflected his own feelings. She didn't want to let go of what had happened. It happened, and neither did he. Are you sure you don't regret it? Sophie asked again, her voice soft but firm. I'm sure, James replied with conviction. I don't regret it, not for a second. Sophie's lips twitched into a small, tentative smile, and James could see the relief in her eyes. He could see how his words seemed to make her feel better. It wasn't that the uncertainty was completely gone. There was a sense of peace now, and they both understood that what they had just experienced wasn't something to be dismissed or forgotten. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, and the silence between them wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was awkward or uncomfortable, but it was also filled with the weight of everything they had shared and the intensity of the connection that had formed between them. It wasn't something that could easily be put into words, but it was there, undeniable and real. Sophie took a deep breath, and her fingers played nervously with the fabric of her scrubs as she looked around the room. The sterile, clinical environment suddenly felt out of place, almost surreal, given the intimacy they had just shared. It was strange how a room that had once felt so impersonal now felt charged with the weight of what had happened between them. I never thought this would happen. I was always so careful and professional, Sophie admitted quietly, looking back at him. But when you walked in, it just felt different. James smiled, knowing exactly what she meant. He hadn't expected this either, but from the moment Sophie had entered the room, there had been a spark. There was a kind of energy between them that neither of them could ignore. It had been subtle at first, but it had grown into something that neither of them could deny. I felt it too, James said softly, his voice deep and sincere. From the moment I saw you, I knew there was something. Sophie's eyes softened, and for the first time since their moment together, she seemed to relax completely. The nervousness that had clouded her expression was gone, replaced by something warmer, something more real. I don't know what comes next, she admitted quietly. But I don't want to lose this, James said, nodding and reaching out to take her hand gently in his. We don't have to figure it all out right now. We'll take it one step at a time. We'll figure it out together. Sophie's fingers curled around his, her grip gentle but firm. Together, she echoed, her voice soft but filled with quiet determination. They stood there for a long moment, their hands intertwined, the weight of all they had shared still hanging in the air between them. The future was uncertain, and they both knew it. They knew that what had happened between them would complicate things, but at that moment, neither of them cared. They had found something real in each other, something worth holding on to. James smiled at her. His heart was calm and sure. I don't regret it, he said again. His voice was full of quiet conviction. I don't think you should either, Sophie replied, smiling. Her smile was real, reaching her eyes and softening her whole face. I don't think so, she whispered. James knew they had crossed a line from which they could never go back. He knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The air in the room felt different now, filled with a quiet warmth that hadn't been there before. James and Sophie stood close together, their hands still slightly intertwined. Even though they hadn't figured out what was coming next, there was a sense of peace between them. It was as if they would face whatever challenges came their way together. James could see it in Sophie's eyes. He could see the uncertainty giving way to something softer, something more certain. There was still the question of what the future held, but for now they were focused on the present. In this moment, they were connected. "I wasn't expecting any of this," Sophie said softly, her voice carrying a note of wonder as she looked around the room. James nodded, completely understanding. He hadn't expected it either, and yet here they were, two people who had crossed paths in an ordinary clinic, only to find something extraordinary in each other. What had started out as a routine checkup had turned into something much more meaningful. It was something that had changed them both in ways they hadn't expected. James agreed quietly, his voice filled with warmth. He said that sometimes the unexpected is just what we need. Sophie smiled at that, her eyes lighting up with a soft glow. She said, "Maybe you're right. Maybe that's what this is. It's something we didn't expect, but we needed." The silence in the room was filled with the weight of her words. They both knew that whatever had happened between them wasn't just a one-time thing. It meant something. It was significant. James could still feel the electricity in the air. He could still feel the intensity that had passed between them, but now it was accompanied by something else. An understanding. A mutual acceptance that they had entered new territory. And there was no turning back. Not that either of them wanted to. "What happens now?" Sophie asked quietly. Her voice was filled with curiosity, not fear. She wasn't asking out of fear anymore. She asked because she wanted to know and understand how they would navigate this new space. James took a deep breath. His hands still held hers, grounding them both in the present. "We'll figure it out," he said. His voice was calm. "We'll take it one day at a time." Sophie nodded. Her eyes were soft and filled with a quiet determination. "One day at a time," she repeated. "I think I can do that." There was something reassuring in the way she said it. Something comforting in the simplicity. They didn't need to have all the answers right now. They didn't need to know what every step looked like. All they needed was to take it one day at a time, to navigate the complexities as they arose together. "I didn't think I was going to feel this way," Sophie admitted after a pause. "I thought I'd be filled with regret. I thought I'd be worried about what people would think or what might happen next." James raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her honesty. Now Sophie smiled a soft, genuine smile that made his heart swell. "Maybe this was meant to be," she said. "Maybe we were meant to meet, even if it was under unexpected circumstances." James' heart warmed at her words. He could feel the truth in them, settling deep within him. "You're right," he said softly but firmly. "Everything seems to have lined up just right for this to happen. There's something almost magical about it. They came together despite the odds and the randomness of it all. It's as if life brought them to this very moment. For a reason, a moment neither of them could have foreseen, but which now seemed inevitable." "I'm glad it happened," Sophie said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. James smiled. His grip on her hand tightened a little. "So am I," he replied, his voice filled with quiet conviction. They knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. They had crossed a line, yes, but it wasn't a line of regret. It was a line that had brought them closer and revealed something real between them. Sophie began tentatively, "I think we should just see where this goes. No pressure, no expectations, just see what happens." James smiled at that, his heart light as he nodded in agreement. "I think that's the best idea," he said. "No pressure, no expectations, just us." Sophie let out a soft laugh, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and excitement. "Just us," she repeated. "I like the sound of that." With those words, James knew they had reached a new understanding and a new chapter in the story they would write together. It didn't matter that they didn't have all the answers right now. What mattered was that they were both ready to explore whatever came next, hand in hand. The tension that had once filled the room had dissipated, replaced by a calm that settled between them like a soft blanket. There was no need to rush. They didn't need to have it all figured out. They just needed to take it one step at a time, together, as they stood there, close but not rushing. James felt a sense of clarity come over him. He had walked into the clinic that morning expecting nothing more than a routine checkup, but he had left with something far greater, something he didn't even know he was looking for. In that moment, with Sophie by his side, James knew that whatever came next would be an adventure worth taking. Sometimes, the unexpected is exactly what we need, and that's what happened to me. What started out as a routine checkup turned into something that changed my life forever. Life has a way of surprising us, often when we least expect it. The smallest, most ordinary moments can turn into something extraordinary, changing the course of our lives in ways we never imagined. But it's these moments that remind us of the power of connection. They demonstrate the raw, undeniable energy that can draw two people together, even when they didn't see it coming. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, comment below, and share your thoughts. What would you do in a situation like this? And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss what we have coming up next. Click the bell icon to stay up to date on all of our latest content. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Stay curious, stay connected, and check out the videos we recommend in this playlist.